Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs Fan World. And here is today's content. The judge's decision to permanently block Donald Trump's deployment of the National Guard to Portland represents far more than a judicial rebuke. It is a constitutional reckoning, a moment when the American system was forced to confront its own fragility, to reaffirm that the rule of law, not the will of one man, defines the republic. Beneath the legal language of exceeding authority lies a deeper philosophical drama, a democracy defending itself from its own executive. To understand this moment, one must return to the summer of 2020, when protests against racial injustice swept through American cities. In Portland, demonstrations turned chaotic, and the Trump administration responded not with dialogue, but with deployment. Federal officers in unmarked uniforms roamed the streets, detaining citizens without clear legal grounds. The move shocked observers, both domestically and abroad, not simply for its force, but for what it symbolized: the fusion of political theater and state violence in the heart of a democracy that had long lectured others about the sanctity of civil rights. The president justified his actions in the language of law and order, a phrase that echoes through the darker corridors of American history. Yet what he called order was, in truth, assertion, an attempt to demonstrate federal dominance over dissent. The court's ruling that Trump had exceeded his authority strikes at the heart of that impulse. It reasserts a fundamental American principle that the president is not sovereign but servant, that security cannot be purchased at the price of liberty. But the decision's significance reaches far beyond constitutional doctrine. It exposes the existential tension at the core of modern democracy, the balance between freedom and fear, between the state's power to protect and its temptation to control. Every democracy at its breaking point faces the same test: whether it will defend its citizens or defend itself from them. In Portland, that test arrived, and the judiciary for once chose restraint over repression. For the United States, this episode is not merely legal, but moral. It demonstrates how populism, when fused with executive power, can erode the delicate architecture of constitutional governance. Trump's attempt to deploy the National Guard was not a military necessity. It was a symbolic act, a gesture of domination disguised as defense. His message was clear: when the people disobey, the state will not reason with them, it will command. Yet, in a paradox that defines the American experience, it was not the legislature or the executive that restored balance, it was the judiciary. The same branch so often dismissed as elitist or activist emerged as the last guardian of federal restraint. The ruling is therefore not simply a rejection of Trump's authority, but a reaffirmation that American democracy still retains an immune system, weakened perhaps, but not dead. The world watched closely. For adversaries like Russia and China, the episode confirmed what they have long claimed, that America's moral authority is performative, that the same state preaching liberty abroad struggles to practice it at home. For allies in Europe, it signaled a deeper unease. If Washington cannot control its own executive impulses, how can it lead the moral order of the West? Thus, the Portland ruling becomes more than a local or national event. It is a microcosm of empire in decline. It reveals a state fighting not against enemies at its borders, but contradictions within its soul. The judge's injunction may have halted the National Guard, but it cannot halt the question that now hangs over American democracy: can a republic built on law survive leaders who no longer believe in it? In the tradition of Jefferson, Lincoln, and King, the court's decision restores, if only momentarily, the American ideal that power must yield to principle, even when principle is inconvenient. Yet, as Jeffrey Sachs might warn, a single ruling cannot heal a fractured nation. It can only remind it that liberty, once surrendered to fear, rarely returns intact. The Portland ruling, while ostensibly a domestic judicial act, reverberates far beyond U.S. borders. It exposes the weakening core of American authority, not only in law, but in moral legitimacy. A nation that once claimed to embody the rule of law now finds itself mired in disputes over the very definition of lawful power. What the world witnessed in Trump's attempted deployment of the National Guard was not simply a constitutional overreach, but a symptom of the deeper fragmentation of American governance, a system turning inward, devouring its own credibility. Domestically, this event reveals how political polarization has metastasized into institutional paralysis. Federal and state governments no longer act as partners in a shared democratic project, but as adversaries locked in mutual suspicion. The deployment order to Portland symbolized the federal government's attempt to override local autonomy, an act that echoes imperial logic rather than Republican restraint. The court's decision to block it thus marks a rare moment when the judiciary reasserted the boundaries of constitutional order. Yet the very need for such judicial intervention speaks volumes about the erosion of political self-restraint, when the balance of power must be restored by decree rather than dialogue. Democracy itself begins to fray. Globally, this disarray carries immense symbolic weight. For decades, Washington's moral authority rested on its ability to project coherence, the image of a system stable, lawful, and self-correcting. But the sight of federal agents clashing with citizens in American streets undermined that narrative irreparably. Foreign capitals from Moscow to Berlin, from Beijing to New Delhi, watched as the self-proclaimed leader of the free world confronted internal unrest with the tools of coercion. The hypocrisy was unmistakable. A nation that condemned authoritarian crackdowns abroad now teetered on the edge of one at home. The geopolitical consequences of this domestic fracture are profound. The United States' power has never derived solely from its military arsenal or economic size. It has always rested on the idea of America, the belief that it represented a model of governance grounded in law, liberty, and restraint. When that image collapses, deterrence weakens, alliances strain, and adversaries advance. NATO, long dependent on American political cohesion, increasingly appears as an alliance held together by inertia rather than conviction. The Portland crisis, trivial as it might seem in military terms, signaled to both allies and rivals that the American center no longer holds. For Russia and China, such internal disarray is both vindication and opportunity. Moscow, in particular, interprets America's internal discord as evidence of systemic decline, proof that liberal democracy is neither morally superior nor politically sustainable. Kremlin media eagerly amplified the scenes from Portland, portraying them as the natural outcome of Western hypocrisy. In their narrative, the ruling against Trump is not a triumph of justice, but a sign of weakness, a nation divided against itself, whose institutions are forced to act as firewalls against their own leaders. For Europe, the reaction was more ambivalent. On the one hand, the court's decision reassured European observers that the American judiciary remains capable of restraining executive excess. On the other, it deepened doubts about America's capacity for global leadership. How can a power consumed by domestic discord credibly champion democracy abroad? The credibility gap widens with every televised confrontation between citizens and their government, every courtroom ruling that corrects the president's hand. Philosophically, the episode embodies what Sachs might call the internal entropy of empire. The United States, like all great powers before it, now faces the paradox of maintaining external order while losing internal equilibrium. Its institutions still function, but they no longer command the reverence that once gave them force. Each crisis of authority, whether judicial or political, accelerates the erosion of legitimacy. In this sense, the Portland case becomes more than a chapter in Trump's presidency. It becomes a mirror reflecting America's moral fatigue. The line between governance and domination, between protection and control, grows thinner with each confrontation. The judiciary may have restored constitutional order in one instance, but it cannot restore the collective faith that sustains it. And without faith in law, in restraint, in shared purpose, even the mightiest democracy begins to unravel, not with revolution, but with exhaustion. The Portland ruling, though domestic in nature, rippled outward across the geopolitical landscape, unsettling not only America's internal balance, but the architecture of Western unity itself. NATO, the transatlantic alliance built on the promise of collective defense and democratic solidarity, has long depended on more than military power. Its foundation rests on a shared belief in legitimacy, the conviction that Western institutions operate under the rule of law, guided by restraint and moral purpose. Yet each episode of internal disorder in the United States, from the Capitol riots to the militarized streets of Portland, chips away at this moral scaffolding. The alliance now faces an uncomfortable truth. It cannot project stability abroad while the heart of its system convulses at home. For decades, Washington's leadership within NATO was sustained not merely by weapons or wealth, but by example. The United States presented itself as the model of constitutional equilibrium, where civilian authority constrained force and where moral legitimacy amplified power. Trump's attempt to deploy the National Guard against American citizens and the subsequent judicial intervention exposed a fissure in that narrative. For European allies, the event was a reminder that the American experiment, once presumed exceptional, is no longer immune to the political pathologies it once sought to cure abroad. The practical consequence is a growing unease within NATO capitals. Paris and Berlin, already wary of Trump's unilateralism, began to speak more openly of European strategic autonomy, a polite euphemism for a world in which the United States can no longer be relied upon to embody, let alone defend, democratic norms. If Washington's president can threaten his own citizens with military force, what credibility remains in America's moral critique of Russia or China? The alliance's claim to be the guardian of the free world begins to sound hollow when its leader must be restrained by its own courts. From Moscow's vantage point, this internal disunity is geopolitical gold. The Kremlin understands that NATO's cohesion depends as much on perception as on policy. Every image of chaos in American streets, every court ruling that reveals the fragility of its constitutional order erodes the aura of Western superiority. The Russian state media amplifies these moments, relentlessly portraying the United States not as a beacon of democracy, but as a declining empire consumed by its contradictions. This narrative resonates deeply across the global South, where nations long skeptical of Western moral claims see confirmation of their doubts. Meanwhile, within NATO itself, strategic coherence is faltering. The alliance remains militarily formidable but politically fragmented. While the U.S. debates its domestic crises, Europe faces its own tensions over energy defense spending and the meaning of Western values. The moral unity that once defined NATO has been replaced by a pragmatic cynicism, cooperation where convenient, distance where necessary. Philosophically, the collapse of moral coherence precedes the collapse of empires. As Sachs might observe, military alliances survive on trust, not only treaties. Once that trust dissolves, once allies begin to doubt the moral center of leadership, the machinery of cooperation becomes hollow. The United States, distracted by its domestic divisions and discredited by its internal contradictions, risks transforming NATO from a community of values into a consortium of convenience. The ruling in Portland thus resonates as a cautionary echo when a leader must be restrained by his own courts, it is not merely a personal rebuke. It is a geopolitical tremor. It signals to the world that the West's moral consensus is no longer self-evident, that the idea of democracy as disciplined self-governance is fraying under the pressures of populism and fear. In the end, the health of NATO mirrors the health of the republic that anchors it. A United States uncertain of its own identity cannot lead a coalition in defense of freedom. For the first time since its founding, the alliance faces not an external adversary, but an internal void, a crisis of meaning. The Portland ruling, viewed through this lens, is both a victory for law and a warning for history. The West's greatest threat is not Russian aggression, but the moral disintegration of the idea that once made it strong. From Moscow's perspective, the Portland ruling and the broader turbulence within the United States are not isolated incidents of domestic discord. They are strategic signals of decline. For Russia's leadership, every internal conflict in America, every instance in which U.S. institutions seem to turn inward against themselves, reinforces a narrative that has guided Russian foreign policy for 2 decades. The West is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. To the Kremlin, the judicial blocking of Trump's National Guard deployment is not evidence of judicial virtue, but of systemic fragility, proof that American power is constrained not by morality, but by chaos. The Russian state has always viewed U.S. domestic instability through the prism of opportunity. Unlike Washington, which tends to frame internal disorder as a crisis to be contained, Moscow treats it as an indicator to be exploited. Since the early 2000s, Vladimir Putin has pursued a long-term geopolitical strategy aimed not at direct confrontation, but at erosion, the steady weakening of Western cohesion through disinformation, division, and moral fatigue. The Portland episode fits perfectly into this framework. Russian analysts see it as confirmation that the United States can no longer balance authority with legitimacy. A state that must rely on courts to restrain its own executive power looks to Moscow like a democracy on life support. In Russian strategic thought, legitimacy is a resource as critical as oil or arms. When that legitimacy drains from the West, Moscow's leverage rises. Each televised protest in the U.S., each instance of political paralysis becomes propaganda fuel for Russian media. The narrative is consistent and deliberate. The West that lectures others about democracy is devouring itself. The rules-based order is a mask for hypocrisy. The liberal world is unfit to lead. This message resonates deeply across regions where Western intervention once carried moral authority in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, now weary of double standards and eager for alternative alliances. It is crucial to understand that Russia's strategic patience is built on time, not confrontation. Putin does not need to challenge NATO directly to achieve victory. He only needs to wait for it to corrode from within. The American crisis of legitimacy, from the Capitol riots to the Portland Overreach, accelerates this process. Each moment of moral inconsistency in Washington makes Moscow's worldview more plausible, that global stability should be multipolar, not moral, that power, not principle, governs history. Moreover, the Kremlin reads Trump's authoritarian tendencies with cold detachment. While many in the West interpret them as dangerous deviations, Moscow sees them as vindication, evidence that liberal democracy is not the antithesis of authoritarianism, but its mirror image when stripped of restraint. Trump's attempt to militarize domestic governance is, in Russian eyes, a reflection of the same state logic they practice: openly security before liberty, order before dissent. When the U.S. courts intervene to stop him, Moscow does not see justice. It sees dysfunction, an empire unable to align its ideals with its instincts. On the diplomatic front, Russia capitalizes on this image of Western disorder by deepening its partnerships with China, Iran, and the global South. The narrative of a decaying West underpins Moscow's outreach to nations disillusioned with U.S. dominance. Every fissure in American democracy becomes an invitation for alternative alignments, the BRICS, the Eurasian Economic Union, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to present themselves as post-Western models of governance. Economically, Russia also senses advantage. Western instability weakens investor confidence and strains the credibility of the dollar-led financial order. The more Washington is consumed by domestic struggle, the less capacity it has to maintain sanctions or coordinate global diplomacy. For Moscow, time is a strategic asset. While America argues with itself, Russia quietly builds endurance in industry, in defense, in international diplomacy. Philosophically, this dynamic embodies what Jeffrey Sachs might call the paradox of power in decline. The stronger a state becomes militarily, the weaker it grows morally when it cannot govern itself. Moscow recognizes this paradox intuitively. Russia's global strategy no longer depends on superiority in weaponry, but on superiority in narrative, the ability to appear coherent while the West appears chaotic. Thus, Russia's reaction to the Portland ruling will not be military, but rhetorical and psychological. It will amplify America's contradictions, expand its influence among the disillusioned, and deepen the story that has become its most effective weapon, that the age of Western leadership has ended not through defeat, but through self-destruction. In this, how can a nation defend democracy abroad when it must defend it against its own government? How can it lead alliances built on the rule of law when its own executive challenges that very rule? These are not rhetorical questions. They are existential ones. Jeffrey Sachs might say that legitimacy, not dominance, is the true currency of global leadership, and legitimacy is eroding. The spectacle of a president seeking to use the National Guard for domestic suppression, followed by a court forced to intervene, does not read as constitutional resilience to the rest of the world. It reads as decay. To allies, it evokes doubt. To adversaries, confirmation. To history, warning. America's empire of moral persuasion, painstakingly built over decades, is unraveling, not from external invasion, but from internal corrosion. The collapse of moral authority is always gradual before it is sudden. It begins when fear replaces trust, when security becomes a substitute for justice. In Trump's America, that transformation has accelerated the rhetoric of law and order, masking the will to dominate the machinery of democracy, turned inward against its own people. The Portland episode is therefore both symptom and symbol of democracy at war with itself, fighting not for ideals, but for control. For NATO, for the West, for the very idea of liberal civilization, the implications are grave. When Washington loses its moral compass, the entire alliance drifts. Europe cannot long sustain unity under the leadership of a power that wields law as an instrument rather than a covenant. The image of American troops prepared to confront protesters in an American city will echo longer in global memory than any battlefield victory abroad. It transforms the United States from moral exemplar into cautionary tale. Russia and China, watching this decline unfold, do not need to hasten it. They understand the rhythm of imperial entropy, how great powers collapse, not from defeat, but from disbelief. The more America insists on its exceptional virtue, the more visible its contradictions become. The Portland ruling, though judicially sound, cannot mend the fracture it reveals, the widening gap between the America that exists and the America it imagines itself to be. Philosophically, the ruling reaffirms a truth older than the Republic itself, that law is only as strong as the virtue of those who enforce it. a society that must rely on judges to remind its leaders of restraint is already navigating the twilight of its democratic maturity. What comes next is not guaranteed renewal, but moral reckoning, the slow, painful realization that liberty without humility becomes tyranny in another form.